When I was a kid growing up in Mesa, Arizona, I remember not long after we had moved to Mesa, there was a knock at the door, and a young lady was at the door asking for food for a food drive. And I said, oh, of course. And I went and grabbed some cans out of the pantry, and I gave them to her. And she looked at me and she said, are you in our ward? And I said, what's a ward? And she said, never mind. And then I asked her, I said, oh, are you collecting food for a tzedakah project? And she said, what's a tzedakah project? And I said, it's okay, never mind. And despite that miscommunication, I actually spent a lot of time growing up with Mormon students, friends, colleagues, and was surrounded more by Mormonism, a culture of Mormonism, than Judaism in the small Jewish community that I lived in Mesa, Arizona. And during that time, I never would have imagined that Jewish mysticism would appear in any way in the Mormon tradition. And what I want to talk about today are the ways in which the appearance of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah in many different places, because we do find it emerging in a lot of surprising locations, maybe shouldn't be as surprising to us after all. The role of Kabbalah in the development of a lot of Jewish and Christian religious forms is something that we see starting in the Middle Ages. And we tend to think of Jewish mysticism as a secret. And as a result, we expect it to be something that only a very few people know about. And it's that perception of Jewish secrecy that I want us to maybe rethink a little bit. Because clearly, Jewish mysticism has been an important way of thinking about Judaism and an important way of thinking about religion and the world for many people, both Jewish and non-Jewish, in particular in various Christian communities since the Renaissance. And this public face of Kabbalah is one that I think is a little bit underappreciated. In fact, there's no reason to think that Kabbalah wouldn't play a role in the development of Mormonism, given that Kabbalah was very available and accessible in English in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. At the time when so much religious creativity was happening in America, when Joseph Smith burst onto the scene, Kabbalah was certainly not a secret. It certainly wasn't something only accessible to Jews, and in fact, in many ways, American Christians were more interested in Kabbalah, especially through Freemasonry, than American Jews were in some cases. And so I want us to think about some of the ways that Kabbalah has been important and some of the ways that Kabbalistic texts have been available by looking at the specific example of the development of Mormonism. Now, I also want to add the little caveat to this talk that in no way is this intended to debunk or confirm or call into question Mormon truth claims about the prophecy of Joseph Smith. Based on Smith's own descriptions of his prophetic method, the argument I'm going to present today works just as well for practitioners and professors of Mormonism as for academics who study it. This is an argument made by Professor Ann Taves at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as a recent PhD from there, Dr. Stephen Fleming. And they note that in a sermon that Joseph Smith gave in 1843, he states that he was commanded by God to seek truth wherever it may be found in any tradition in order, quote, to get all of the good in the world and come out a pure Mormon. And part of his prophetic method involved reading widely and studying, and then to put that through a kind of process of refinement, through his own internal process of prophecy, in order to understand the truth that can be extracted from other truths that are found out in the world and in other traditions. So that way of thinking about Mormon truth claims, I think I just want to sort of leave that as a way of imagining how this question of the role of Kabbalah in Mormonism isn't intended as a rejection of Mormon truth claims about their own tradition. So now Mormonism is a really important phenomenon, of course, in the United States. Leo Tolstoy describes Mormonism as the quintessential American religion. And the place of Kabbalah in this tradition tells us a lot about the place of Jewish secret knowledge in the 19th century and in Western Christian society more broadly. the story I want to think about today isn't so much a story about religious truths, it's a story about people and books, and the way that people and books share ideas about the world. So now, this sort of interest in Kabbalah is largely the result of the question of how Jewish revelation is configured in Christian religious discourses. There's a very broad acceptance of the notion historically in 19th century forms of Protestantism, Christianity, and this, of course, is a very long tradition, that Jews were present at Mount Sinai and therefore are conveyors of divine truths that are central to the construction of Christianity, the embrace of the Old Testament, and the embrace of other types of prophetic revelation that was conveyed by Jews to the world is central to Christian self-conceptions. Therefore, when we find the development of a Jewish mystical doctrine, of a secret idea that claims to have been also revealed at Mount Sinai, it's unsurprising that some Christian groups in particular times and places take an interest in that doctrine. And Kabbalah does present itself as exactly that kind of secret. And the way that that secret then plays a role in other religious environments is an interesting phenomenon in the history of religion. So now I'm going to give a quick sort of overview for Mormonism for people who are not familiar with that. Then I'm going to give a quick overview of Kabbalah for people who are not familiar with that. So we'll see how quickly I can get through these two very big topics. So Mormon history, very quickly. Joseph Smith was born in Sharon, Vermont in 1805. And in around 1816, there were a few moves his family had made due to economic hardship, and they end up in Palmyra, New York, an area that was described sometimes with the expression of being the burned over district, because there had been such burning religious fervor in that part of the country. It was a place of tremendous religious creativity, especially among Protestant Christians in the United States. In 1820, Joseph Smith has his first religious vision, in which he is offered forgiveness and the error of other Christian sects is noted to him. And then in 1823, he has a visitation from the angel Moroni, describing a gold plate book that's hidden in the hill Cumorah in upstate New York. And it's said to describe the people who used to inhabit North America and to provide, quote, the fullness of the gospel. And in 1827, Smith is given permission to recover these plates and begins to translate them with the seer stones that he had, which he refers to as the Urim and Tumim. These are the gemstones described in the Hebrew Bible that provide prophetic insight. The book is written in what is called Reformed Egyptian, and it's translated over the course of several years with the assistance of a man named Oliver Cowdery, and this book becomes the Book of Mormon. Smith and Cowdery together have a vision of John the Baptist in 1829, in which the Aaronic priesthood, meaning the priesthood of the descendants of Aaron, is conferred upon them. And then in 1830, the Book of Mormon is published. So the basic contents of the Book of Mormon is that it describes events in North America from around the years 600 to 400 BCE. It describes the family of Lehi, a prophet in Jerusalem, who leaves Jerusalem before the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, and they move to North America, and claims that there's then descended the Nephites and the Lamanites who fight wars, and also claims that describes an appearance of Jesus in the New World. So the issue of the 10 lost tribes in North America, this is a really interesting question, that the Native American peoples were regarded as descendants of the 10 lost tribes. We actually find Jews making this claim not long after Columbus set sail. In the early 15th century, a Jewish exile from Spain named Joseph ben Abraham Halevi makes this claim in a fairly obscure text. He was a Kabbalist from Spain who moved to North Africa and then lived and wrote most of his life in Jerusalem. Also, about 100 years later, this claim was made by none other than Menashe ben Israel, who was an important Jewish statesman, a Kabbalist. He also was the one who argued to Oliver Cromwell that Jews should be allowed to re-enter the British Empire because the Bible predicts that Jews will be gathered in from the four corners of the earth when redemption comes, and how could it be possible for them to be gathered in from the four corners of the earth if they don't inhabit all four corners? And if they're not living in the British Empire, clearly at least one corner is missing. So this was his argument, and Cromwell found that very compelling, and he readmitted Jews at that point since they had previously been expelled from England. As a Canadian, I find this very fortunate. So in 1830, Smith moves to Kirtland, Ohio, and he had a doctrine of continuing revelation. It's not that the Book of Mormon was a singular revelation that he conveyed. He had a notion that there was ongoing revelation, and he recorded many of these revelations in Pearl of Great Price, one composition, and Doctrines and Covenants is another. A temple was built there in Kirtland, but there was a lot of tension with the surrounding population, and so 1836, the Mormons were forced out of Kirtland, and they moved to Illinois, in which they established a city called Nauvoo, from the biblical Hebrew word for beautiful. And this quickly becomes a large and powerful place. It was a settlement of about 10,000 people fairly quickly, and by 1845 there were about 15,000 people, nearly the size of Chicago. So Nauvoo was a really important location where some of the last work was done by Joseph Smith. They also had a successful mission spreading Mormonism to England. They constructed a temple in Nauvoo. And in 1843, Smith had two very important final revelations, or revelations towards the end of his life. One about the baptism of the dead, and another about polygyny, or plural marriage. And in 1844, Smith announced an intention to run for the president. He gives a really important discourse that we're going to talk about in a few minutes called the King Follett Discourse. And there's some question about ordering the destruction of an opposition newspaper, which then led to other kinds of controversy. He was imprisoned, and on June 27th of that year, Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by a mob. So in addition to the Book of Mormon and Pearl of Great Price and Doctrines and Covenants, there were other things that were published in a newspaper, a periodical in Nauvoo called Times and Seasons. And this provides an incredibly rich wealth of data for the study of religion in this period and the study of Mormonism. We also have really meticulous record keeping by the Mormon Church itself. And what I have to say is the best research website I have ever seen for the study of a religion. Really tremendous digital access to manuscripts, and it's really impressive. And so it's with some of the material from this collection that I want to think today. But now very basically, what is Kabbalah that I'm going to suggest played a role in the development of Joseph Smith's religious discourse? Kabbalah emerges in the Middle Ages, around the 12th and 13th centuries, first in southern France and then in Spain. And the most famous composition to emerge from medieval Kabbalah is the Sefer HaZohar, or Book of Splendor. This is Madonna's favorite book. But there were many, many other texts, literally thousands of folios written in Hebrew and Aramaic in the Middle Ages that relate Kabbalistic ideas, often in very accessible form. The Zohar claims to be a book written by the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, describing the mysteries of the Torah, and that it was hidden, lost really to the Jewish tradition, but rediscovered in the 13th century. And the tradition holds that it was, at least the textual evidence holds, that a man named Moses de Leon had a manuscript of the Zohar that he then copied sections of and shared with his friends, and it spread that way. So a hidden book come to light. Kabbalah is based on this notion of the doctrine of the 10 divine emanations, or 10 divine luminosities, called sfirot. Sfirot refers to these luminous entities within God rather than spheres. It's not from the same Greek word for sphere. It's from the Hebrew word sapir, which means luminous. It's also where we get the word sapphire. According to the Kabbalists, the 10 Sfirot emerge from an infinite God, an ineffable, unknowable God called Ein Sof, or the Endless. These 10 Sfirot are emanated from God, and then from there the world is emanated in a continuum of being, this sort of emanation from God through the Sfirot and into the world. They also argue that Jewish people have a divine soul endowed in their body. We don't find this in the rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud, in the Midrash, or in the Bible. Where we find this really appearing is in the mid-13th century among Kabbalists. And they also describe that because of these divine souls within their bodies, through the practice of Jewish law with their bodies, they're able to impact the 10 Sfirot, causing them to draw together and drawing divine blessing down into the world, from Ein Sof into the material realm. And it's the material plane where the practice of Judaism takes place, observing the Sabbath, observing the laws of kosher food, prayer. All of these things are done ultimately with the body. And Kabbalists provide a religious discourse for understanding the power and the impact of these religious practices. That notion that human behaviors impact the divine realm is referred to as theurgy. And the theurgic principle is a really important shared idea between Mormonism and Judaism. And also both do have a discourse of human incarnation. For the Kabbalists, they have this notion that Jews are manifestation of the divine in their body, that they sustain the world through the procreation of new Jewish bodies via sacred marriage, and through the practice of Jewish law. This is a fairly radical reformulation of the rabbinic tradition, and what's remarkable about it is how quickly it was embraced. The Zohar goes on in a few hundred years to become a canonized text. Really, alongside the Bible and the Talmud is the Zohar. No other text in the history of rabbinic Judaism has attained that kind of status. This Kabbalistic tradition goes on to have sort of many moments of fame, both within rabbinic circles and in Christian circles. Texts are translated into Latin in the Renaissance, and then translations into English happen in the early modern period. So now some of the basic theological claims in Mormonism that I think bear affinities to Kabbalistic ideas. One is the notion of priesthood and the ordinances thereof. So the idea of the Aaronic priesthood, or priesthood of Aaron, the priesthood of Melchizedek, and the priesthood of Enoch. These sort of three levels of priesthood and the emphasis on religious ritual having an impact on the divine realm and having, in response to that, an impact in the cosmic realm. For Kabbalists, Jews maintain the fabric of being itself. They maintain the universe through their religious practices. There are affinities between that and Mormon notions of priesthood ordinances. The divinity of the soul and its connection to God. Obviously, that's not a uniquely Kabbalistic idea, but it's one that emerges in Mormonism in ways that are evocative of Kabbalistic ideas. Also notions of three levels in the divine world and in the afterlife, the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial. In Mormonism, there's a three-level notion of the divine realm as well, operative in Kabbalah. The sanctity of marriage and procreation as a sacred duty connected to the divine realm. This is something we find emphasized in a really pronounced way in Mormonism and in Kabbalah. Ongoing revelation and the utility of truth in altered forms in other places. Kabbalists also regarded themselves as having access to divine revelation. And Kabbalists in some of their books are referred to as being a Navi, a prophet. And despite the fact that in more conservative sectors of the rabbinic tradition, prophecy is said to end with the end of biblical revelation, Kabbalists are not afraid to use the term prophet in reference to themselves. The notion of a bond between matter and spirit, emanating from the connection of everything to God, and thus the value of the practice of law and ritual. This is something we find in both traditions. As, of course, the theurgic principle, the notion of things above and things below, reflecting one another, paralleling one another, and impacting one another. These are discourses between Mormonism and Kabbalism that raise the question of what kind of historical lines of influence there could be between these two traditions. So now, of course, if the Book of Mormon was an uncovering of ancient secrets, it reminds you of the Zohar. But in what way could Joseph Smith had access to these traditions within Judaism? And I would argue that there were really quite a few different points of access for Joseph Smith to have had some exposure to Kabbalistic ideas. One is that Smith had a particular interest in the study of biblical Hebrew, and he studied Hebrew with John Satius in Kirtland in 1835. Joshua Satius was from an important Sephardic Jewish community in New York, but he was living in Ohio, and he was a Hebrew teacher at Oberlin College and tutored Joseph Smith. In fact, we have a copy of his diploma declaring Smith proficient in biblical Hebrew. So Smith really sat down and went through this workbook that Satius had developed for kids at Oberlin and completed this course of study. In Times and Seasons, which I mentioned earlier, Smith cites none other than Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch when describing the value of commandment and the obligations of the practice of religious law. We also find in the Book of Mormon interesting descriptions of the value of Jewish secrets and Jewish texts for understanding the divine word. So in the book of Nephi 13:20 through 25, there's a discussion of Gentiles going into exile and that they carry with them a book that, quote, proceeded from the mouth of a Jew. And this is concerning their covenant with God. And the text notes that, quote, these things go forth from the Jews in purity unto the Gentiles according to that which is in God. This is one of the examples of description of Jewish truths that are of value to Christians and are of value to Mormons, and that this was part of how God conveys his truth in the Book of Mormon is via Jewish texts. We also find this goal of sort of restoring the true gospel and the true message of God, which has been perverted by the church since then, where Jewish knowledge is described as important for the spread of this true message of the church. And that's not a unique move within the Mormon case. We find that differences over doctrine and practice in the history of Christianity have sometimes made recourse to the claim that Kabbalah conveys the real true message of God, conveys the true religion of Jesus Christ, and that therefore Kabbalah can be mined as a repository for Christian truths that Jews have conveyed to the world, even if they themselves don't understand them. And that was a standard way of imagining the way that Jews even conveyed the Hebrew Bible to the world, that they didn't understand its Christological meaning that they didn't understand its anticipation of the New Testament, and in some ways they are blind readers of their own texts. If you look at almost any cathedral built in the Middle Ages in Europe, you'll see ecclesia and synagoga, so representing two queens representing the church and the synagogue, Christians and Jews. Synagoga is always blindfolded. And the reason why is because she is a blind reader of her own law. So there's nothing particularly radical or surprising about imagining that Jews could be regarded as conveyors of divine truths that are not the same as the ones that they themselves espouse. Some scholars have argued that Joseph Smith's doctrines bear really strong similarities to Hermeticism and other forms of occult Western esoteric tradition, as well as the version of some of those traditions in Freemasonry. And there's nothing particularly surprising about that. Smith had been a Freemason, and nearly every white man of a certain class in the United States at this period was a Freemason or knew someone who was a Freemason. Freemasonry was another very public, secret discourse. But I'm not certain, first of all, I wouldn't argue that other forms of esotericism weren't important to Joseph Smith, and in all likelihood they were. But I think that the role of Kabbalah is vastly underplayed and underappreciated in that explanation for some of Smith's ideas. It fits actually better with Smith's worldview to look to Kabbalah as a place that he might have turned to for his own prophetic mission, because Jews were already a site of esoteric or secret revelation. Also, the similarities between Kabbalah and the kinds of esoteric traditions or occult traditions that were common in the United States and that were part of the parlance of Freemasonry bear affinities to Kabbalah because they also read Kabbalistic texts. So even if we imagine that there was an exposure to these other occult traditions, the version of those occult traditions that he would have encountered probably were similar to Kabbalah because those authors were also reading Kabbalistic books. So now, how would he have had direct access to Kabbalistic books or descriptions of Kabbalah itself? And the answer is that it's not hard to find it all. Here's a few examples. In The History of Philosophy by William Enfield, published in 1791, there's a place when it talks about the history of Judaism, and it says, quote, "The Kabbalah, or mystical interpretation of the law, was brought over from Egypt to Palestine by Rabbi Shimon ben Shattach." And this was common in many of these encyclopedias at the time, encyclopedias that would be found in any common library in many homes, was the idea that Kabbalah, usually spelled C-A-B-B-A-L-A or C-A-B-A-L-A, that Kabbalah was an ancient mystery tradition that Jews adopted in Egypt and then brought to Palestine and incorporated into Judaism. And this is why Solomonic knowledge which often, of course, is extolled in Freemasonry, was seen as a kind of Egyptian knowledge. And of course, let's not forget, the Book of Mormon was said to be written in Reformed Egyptian. So this Egyptian-Jewish mystical nexus was something that was commonly described in many of these books. In the same History of Philosophy by Enfield, it talks about the Kabbalah some more and mentions Shimon Yochaides, or Shimon Bar Yochai, who wrote the book The Zohar, and notes the transfer of this knowledge then into Spain. He then notes, another interesting example is in the Encyclopedia Americana, makes similar claims about the derivation of Jewish secret knowledge from Egypt. We also find in the History of Jews from the Destruction of the Temple to Modern Times by Hannah Adams, published in London in 1818, draws on some of these earlier descriptions of Jewish mysticism and describes a lot of things about Kabbalah, many of which I just sort of described for you, describes how Kabbalistic ideas work, also has an appendix on none other than Menashe ben Israel and his theory of the derivation of the Native Americans from the lost tribes of the Israelites. There are other mechanisms, though, for Smith to have access to Kabbalistic texts. There was a book based on a book by Peter Stalin. There was a man named John Allen who wrote a book called Modern Judaism in 1816. And it's funny that that book was based on this other book, which was in turn actually almost a plagiarism of a book written by Johann Andreas Eisenmenger in 1700 in Germany called Entdecktes Judentums, which means Judaism Uncovered. It was a deeply anti-Semitic book, but it was also incredibly well done. And Eisenmenger was a great Hebraist, and he translated an incredible number of texts into German, which was then translated into French and into English. And Eisenmeger's text, I think, is actually the origin of where all of these other books that were circulating in England and then in North America are describing Kabbalistic texts and translating substantial passages from them. Ironically, Eisenmenger, as much as he said he wrote this book to uncover the evil of the Jewish tradition, he became somewhat unintentionally one of the best sources for the Jewish tradition. And as even the great Gershom Scholem, who was mentioned earlier, sort of the founder of the study of Jewish mysticism in the academic world, notes, Eisenmenger was an excellent scholar. His translations are really good. And in many ways, he shared with the modern West many aspects of Jewish texts, especially Jewish mysticism, that hadn't been as accessible before. So now, when we look at the ways in which this interest in Jewish literature circulates, we find that in 1842, a friend and convert named Alexander Niebuhr was a friend of Joseph Smith's, and he was a Jew who had studied Judaism, was pretty knowledgeable, had converted to Christianity and then converted to Mormonism in England, and then came to Nauvoo and also served as Smith's ongoing tutor and reader in Hebrew and in German, and reader of Jewish texts with him. And it's not long after that we find Niebuhr published a two-part essay in the Mormon publication Times and Seasons in Nauvoo, in which he talks about the Jewish idea of the resurrection of the dead, and he says he provides this for, quote, those who have an interest in Jewish literature. Reading Jewish texts as a source of interesting truth for Mormons and for Christians was not something that was considered at all heretical or controversial in this time. But the place where I think we find the most interesting echo of the Jewish tradition is in a very central location in Smith's description of his own sort of most mature argument for his theology. And it's in the King Follett Discourse on April 7th, 1844, not long before Smith's own death, in which he describes the nature of God, his own notion of anthropomorphism, and of apotheosis, or the capacity for humans to become, in a sense, divine. He says, quote, God who sits in yonder heavens, this is based on one of the transcriptions of this text from people who were there. There are multiple transcriptions, again, all meticulously preserved on LDS website. He says, God who sits in yonder heavens is a man like yourselves. That God, if you were to see him today, that holds the worlds, you would see him like a man in form like yourselves. I want you to know the first principle of this law, how consoling to the mourner when they part with a friend, to know that they lay down this body and it will rise and dwell with everlasting burnings, to be an heir of God and joint with Jesus Christ, enjoying the same rise, exaltation, and glory until you arrive at the station of a God. If I should say anything but what was in the Bible, the cry of treason would be heard. I will then go to the Bible. Bereshit, in the beginning. Bereshit is a Hebrew word. Analyze the word. In and through the head. An old Jew added the word, or letter, bet. It read, the head one of the gods brought forth the gods. It's the end of Smith's comment there. So this is actually incredibly similar to one of the most famous passages from the Zohar in Zohar Mantua edition 15a, but similar to many other passages in the Kabbalistic text that describe creation, in which they say the word Bereshit bara, the words Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. Et hashemayim v'et haaretz, the heavens and the earth. They say what that means is with or by means of Reshit, beginning, he created an entity called Elohim, or God. So by means of Reshit, he created Elohim. And so by means of beginning, he created God, or the gods. The word Elohim is a plural word. And what the Kabbalists take that to mean is that the first Sphira, Keter, meaning crown, together with Ein Sof, uses the second Sphira, which they label as the word Reshit, or beginning, to create the third Sphira, Binah, in the creation of the 10 Sphirot. And that there's a secret code to reading the beginning of Genesis to mean it's about the emergence of the 10 Sphirot, and that God uses them to create other ones, that with or by means of Reshit, he creates these other Sphirot. Now, already within Judaism, this is describing a kind of plurality within the divine realm. And Kabbalists were unafraid of that. They really were very comfortable talking about God in this way. What we find happening in Joseph Smith's version of it is that he said it should really read Reshit, beginning, created Elohim, the gods. So the first God created the gods, and that this is about the divinity, the sort of human-like divinity of God, and the creation of humans as a kind, or at least potentially becoming gods as well. So it's similar but different, right? And that's what we would expect. It's reasonable to assume that through a kind of process of internal prophetic revelation or refinement, Smith was able to expose this famous Kabbalistic text, or through exposure to it, was able to render it in his own really unique way. But Smith says, and it's worth noting in the King Follett Discourse, he says he would be happy to use other sources for describing this particular theological point. But he knows that people will cry treason if he uses anything but the Bible, so he'll use the Bible. I think we can take that to mean that he was comfortable using other sources. But he knows that many of his listeners wouldn't be, or at least the critics of Mormonism, maybe not the people there that day, but the people that would hear it in the future. And so he sticks with the Bible, even though he doesn't think that that's the only necessary source that one can use. We find numerous other passages in the Book of Mormon, in Doctrines and Covenants, when Smith refers to God as the endless, Ein Sof. This was a term that was, again, easily located in the texts that I mentioned. This was a notion, if you read about Judaism in something like Allen's Modern Judaism, they use the word modern Judaism to refer to all forms of Judaism after the destruction of the temple. So modern Judaism refers to everything from the Talmud through the Middle Ages and up to the 19th century. There's also a lot of interest in the theurgic principle, or the notion of human actions impacting the divine realm, because humans have this divine pre-existent soul with the power through priesthood to impact the divine realm and the human realm. So in the Book of Mormon, in Helaman 10:7, but it's also articulated in Doctrines and Covenants 132, it says, quote, "Then they shall be gods, because they have no end. Therefore shall they be from everlasting to everlasting, because they continue. Then shall they be above all, because all things are subject unto them. Then shall they be gods, because they have all power, and the angels are subject to them." And it continues on verse 46, saying, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, that whatsoever you sealeth on earth shall be sealed in heaven. And whatsoever you bind on earth, in my name and by my word, saith the Lord, it shall eternally be bound in the heavens. And whatsoever sins you remit on earth shall be remitted eternally in the heavens. And whatsoever sins you retain on earth shall be retained in heaven." So again, this notion of human actions impacting the divine realm, this theurgic conception of religious practice. This is something that isn't obvious in many Protestant traditions, but its resonance with Kabbalah is profound. It's also worth noting that the idea of the continuous connection between the divine and the spiritual with the material is described, according to Smith, in Doctrines and Covenants 88:41, where he says, "And he is above all things," referring to God, "and in all things, and is through all things, and is round about all things, and all things are by him and of him, even God forever and ever." So now, it's possible that this idea could be connected to Jewish mystical texts simply because his exposure to them in English was not something that would have been hard for him to come across. But the number of Kabbalistic ideas that emerge over the course of the Book of Mormon and other writings by Smith is really remarkable. There's also a description, for instance, the three levels of the world in Mormonism, or of the afterlife that we mentioned, the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial. It's interesting that this is described by Neubauer in his article in Doctrines and Covenants, but it's very interesting to note that in Traditions of the Jews by Stalin, the very end of the book cites a passage from the Talmud, from Tractate Rosh Hashanah, in which it notes that when people pass away, they're divided into three camps. Those who are wicked and have to be punished for some period of time, the middling, who will be temporarily punished and then admitted to the world to come, and the righteous, who immediately enter the world to come. So to sum up, I think it's important to note that in a context in which Smith regards himself as restoring a lost religious doctrine, the true revelation from the divine, that it bears a lot of similarities to Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah, which itself claims to be a restored lost doctrine, revealed by God, secretly conveyed by Jews from Mount Sinai, and passed on to later generations. It would be hard to imagine that in that context, Smith, like other important religious thinkers of his day, wouldn't turn to Kabbalistic sources as a place of inspiration. And in fact, the very public face that Kabbalah enjoyed during this time tells us a lot about why we find Kabbalah turning up in so many different places. And again, that started in the Renaissance. Of course, we have the famous example of Pico della Mirandola, who used Kabbalah for his development of Renaissance humanism. But this was something we find with other philosophers, scientists. Isaac Newton took a tremendous interest in Kabbalah. The problem we have when thinking about the history of Kabbalah is we are perhaps deceived by Kabbalah's claims about itself, that it was a secret. But we know the best way to popularize a secret idea is to claim that it's a secret in order for it to have its own public life. Thank you very much.